There's an article in Tech Times that's making the rounds that creationists are using to claim that evolution doesn't happen and that all animals came into being at the same time. I came across such a claim. Let's see what they have to say.
If this isn't the final nail in the coffin for the theory of evolution, I don't know what is.
Alright, remember that line. I'll be coming back to it.
The website Tech Times published an article online not too long ago entitled "Massive Genetic Study Reveals 90% of Earth's Animals Appeared at the Same Time." It says, landmark new research that involves analyzing millions of DNA barcodes has debunked much about what we know today about the evolution of species. Yeah, because it never happened.
The article is referring to a study discussing the rates of mutation in the common ancestors of most animals alive today, which, by the way, is a tiny fraction of the number of species that ever existed. The study says that we can trace the mitochondrial eve of most living species to about 100 to 200,000 years ago. Okay, let's back up. Mitochondrial DNA is a small fraction of DNA that is passed on via the mother. It encodes enzymes that help convert things like food and oxygen into energy. It's fairly similar across species and does not mutate based on the same pressures that will alter the form of the animal. Since most mitochondrial mutations are neutral and not subject to selective pressure, mitochondrial DNA mutates at a stable, predictable rate. Scientists can use this DNA and the known rate of mutation to roughly work out how old a species diverged from a common ancestor. Now, back in the 1980s, there was the mitochondrial Eve theory, where we could trace back the originator of all humans to a single mother, who is theorized to have existed about 99 to 148,000 years ago. All this study is doing is showing the majority of species that exist now can trace their mitochondrial DNA to roughly within a 100,000 year block, 100 to 200,000 years ago. This is not saying that all animals popped into existence at a certain time. Organisms existed billions of years before then. The 100 to 200,000 year mark is simply how far back current existing species can trace their current maternal ancestor. And the scientists' theory is that there is some kind of genetic bottleneck that would account for this similar timing.
The article says, in a massive genetic study, senior research associate at the Program for the Human Environment at Rockefeller University, Mark Stokel, and University of Basel geneticist David Thaler discovered that virtually 90% of all animals on Earth appeared at right around the same time. Surprise, surprise! Science confirms the Bible.
Again, this is not what the study is showing. It in no way claims that all animals simply popped into existence at once, or even within a 100,000 year block. It is claiming that the mitochondrial eves of current species can be traced back to a certain time frame. The animals they evolved from, their ancestors, existed before then. Just, in most cases, those ancestor species do not exist now. It's actually kind of a boring paper, which largely talks about how we should define species, saying that species classification should be done along mitochondrial lines. Saying that this refutes evolution would be like saying that a discussion on defining where certain colors begin and end on the visible light spectrum refutes the existence of vision. No, not that vision.
The article goes on to read, more specifically, they found out that 9 out of 10 animal species on the planet came to being at the same times as humans did some 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. Pretty much like it says on the 6th day of creation week, except for the 100,000 to 200,000 years. The Bible indicates that we were created around 6,000 years ago.
Interesting. So you will wholeheartedly accept any claims in this study that you can twist to support your narrative, but will dismiss anything that contradicts the story you want to believe. Huh. There's a name for that, but I can't quite put my finger on it. In fact, this study is using evolution for the basis for its work, and yet you're dismissing evolution itself. You're using the fact that evolution is the basis for this study, accepting the claims you want to believe, and still saying it proves that evolution isn't real? That's just weird.
Luke chapter 3 verses 23 through 38 lists the genealogy of Jesus Christ all the way back to Adam. And when you do the math, that adds up to around 4,000 years. And since Jesus lived about 2,000 years ago, that comes to a total of about 6,000 years. So life on this planet did not begin about 100,000 to 200,000 years ago.
You're actually right, but in the wrong way. Life did not, as you said, begin about 100 to 200,000 years ago. It began way before that. Nothing in the study contradicts the fact that life began several billion years ago. Simply that it appears that a genetic bottleneck means that most current species can trace their oldest maternal ancestor back to a roughly 100,000 year block.
I know there will be some people in the comments that will criticize the Bible because the dates for the origin of life don't match the article I'm reading. But keep in mind that evolutionists have traditionally claimed that life began over 3 billion years ago.
Yeah, they will claim that, because the article isn't talking about the origin of life, but simply the speciation point of organisms living on Earth now.
So I see this as a step closer to the truth. Let's give them credit. At least they're making progress.
Again, this study is not in any way saying that life began in the past 200 millennia. Life has had billions of years to evolve and grow into the diversity that we see around us.
The article goes on to talk about the COI gene, which is used to create DNA barcodes. And it says, in analyzing the COI of 100,000 species, Stokel and Thaler arrived at the conclusion that most animals appeared simultaneously.
No, that's not what the study has shown. It says that there was a genetic bottleneck in the recent past, geologically speaking, and 90% of current species existing now can trace their ancestry to that bottleneck. It is not in any way saying that creatures suddenly appeared with no progenitors.
They analyzed the gene of 100,000 species. That must have taken countless hours to do, maybe even months or years. Not to mention the cost. I mean, somebody has to pay researchers for their time, right? Yet when you open the Bible and read about 5 minutes into the first page, it tells you practically the same thing. Somebody should tell secular scientists that. It will save them a lot of time and money.
Look, we're not just going to take your word that the claims of the Bible are true. Let's say that I'm wrong, and pretty much every branch of science would have to be incorrect as well, and the Bible is true. Just claiming it would not be enough to convince the scientific minds. Those massive amounts of man-hours will still need to be invested to prove any claims you want to make.
Listen to this though. It just gets better. They found that the neutral mutation across species were not as varied as expected. Neutral mutation refers to the slight DNA changes that occur across generations. They can be compared to tree rings because they can tell how old a certain species or individual is. As to how that could have happened, it's unclear. A likely possibility is the occurrence of a sudden event that caused large-scale environmental trauma and wiped out majority of Earth's species. Remind you of anything? Maybe a global flood?
Yes, a major environmental event would account for such a genetic bottleneck that we see. However, apart from the claims in your holy book, there has never been any evidence of a global flood 4,000 or so years ago. Such an event would have left some kind of evidence, but nothing has been found. Plus, other civilizations at the time kept concurrent records and probably would have noticed a worldwide flood. But there are no Chinese or Egyptian records at the time saying anything like, hey, anybody else knows a bit more precipitation than usual? Just around the 100 millennia time frame discussed, the last glacial period was occurring. That could have led to a massive die-off and severe reduction of species population, which could account for the genetic bottleneck that we do see. No God necessary. This is just a hypothesis. there could have been other environmental factors that caused this convergence of mitochondrial eaves.
Bible-believing Christians have been criticized for years and still get criticized by secular society and God-hating scientists for believing these things. Yet now we have irrefutable scientific evidence that confirms the Bible.
No, you've taken a legitimate study and either ignorantly or deliberately twisted it into claiming something that it doesn't. I don't know which is worse. Quick unscientific poll in the comments. What do you think accounts for the misunderstanding of this study? Deliberate misinterpretation of what they're saying, or simple ignorance?
Just take a look around. Nothing is evolving. It never has evolved. If evolution were true, then we should be able to see intermediate species all around us. An intermediate species would be a step in the evolutionary process, like a half human and a half ape.
No, it doesn't work like that. Transitional species have been found, linking one species through another. Even the concept of a half-man, half-ape doesn't make any sense. Humans are apes. It would be like claiming that I'm half Canadian, half North American. One is a member of the other group. If I am a human, then I am an ape.
But instead, what do we see? We see clear distinction between kinds of life. For example, there is a clear distinction between humans, apes, cats, dogs, birds, and so on.
Since you mentioned the distinct kinds, i.e. dogs and cats, let's look at those two. Yes, evolutionary theory doesn't say you'll get cats from dogs either. If you got an existing animal out of a mating pair from separate species, that would disprove much of evolutionary theory. However, if you understood the theory, you would know that dogs and cats share a common ancestor, specifically in the form of Dormilolocon latori, which existed roughly 56 million years ago, whose descendants slowly diverged into a plethora of different species like cats, dogs, foxes, bears, seals, and other carnivorous mammals.
There's more to the article from Tech Times. I'll leave a link to it in the video description if you'd like to read it in its entirety. It does have an evolutionary bias, but it's fascinating to see that scientists are being confronted with strong evidence that refutes evolution and confirms the Bible.
Again, the paper your article refers to does not in any way refute evolution, and in fact requires evolution to account for the findings that it does come to. If you discount evolution, you will have to discount the entire study, leaving you back at square one with no documentation from this that you can twist to support your narrative. I don't understand how you can even say it has an evolutionary bias and that it refutes evolution at the same time. Now, in general, I prefer to respond to videos like this in order, but I'm going to have to end by going back to the first point you made.
If this isn't the final nail in the coffin for the theory of evolution, I don't know what is.
Well, since this article doesn't do anything to disprove evolution, and even requires evolution to support the conclusions it does come to, it isn't a nail in anything. And by your logic, therefore, there are no nails in the coffin for evolution. You claiming otherwise, and twisting studies like this to say something they don't, is just dishonest. Interesting. So you will wholeheartedly accept any claims of this study that you can twist to support your narrative, but will dismiss anything that contradicts the story you want to believe. There's a name for that, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Gross.